Just want to welcome everyone. My name is Guillermo Metz, and I'm a senior resource educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension, Tompkins County, where I support landowners, farmers, municipal officials, and others across New York State understand and better navigate the large-scale solar development process. This is our fourth and final session of this webinar series. We've been looking at large-scale solar development from a bunch of different angles. All of the sessions are being recorded, and I will send out the link to those recordings to everyone who is registered, and I'll also drop it in the chat in just a minute now, because actually you can find the recordings along with the slides for the first three sessions there already. Those have been posted. And so the series was put together by me with other colleagues, including Joe Lawrence here and folks across Cornell Cooperative Extension, as well as Tom Murphy, who's joined us. And he was formerly with Penn State Extension. He was leading the Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, and he's now the Solar Energy Educational Advisor with the Pennsylvania Association of Township Supervisors, or PSATs. So we have three presenters tonight, and we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please drop your questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those. And tonight's topic is host community benefit agreements. And first up, we're joined by Joe Lawrence, and he's the Cornell Pro Dairy Forage Crop Production System Specialist. And he's also spends a lot of time helping communities navigate large-scale renewable energy projects. And in addition, he's also been active on Lewis County's Industrial Development Agency, and he helped them rewrite their solar pilot policy to disincentivize siting projects on ag land. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. And he'll be followed by Christie Gross, who's the Director of Clean Connect Strategies, which helps build political and community support for clean energy projects, including supporting local groups and countering misinformation that's often used to block these projects. And then finally, we'll hear from Matthew Eisenson, who's a senior fellow leading the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative at Columbia Law School's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And there, among other things, he's conducted research into the best practices for host community benefit agreements for clean air projects. So please take it away, Joe. You should be able to share now.
Thank you. I'll share my screen here. So yeah, we're going to share a little perspective from an agricultural standpoint, and as well as what we've done in Lewis County, which is in northern New York State. And then Christy and Matthew can let you know what I got wrong or what we got wrong in Lewis County. So yeah, as Guillermo mentioned, this has been kind of an interesting overlap with my career and working with mostly the dairy industry, with crop production, and then how that overlaps with solar and that dynamic with solar being put on ag land. So just to start out with a little perspective on New York State, looking over the last 25 years or so based on ag census data. A lot of people, myself included, have been very concerned about our more productive agricultural land being converted into solar, and other land uses. And I continue to think this is something we have to balance. We certainly need renewable energy, but putting it on some of our more productive agricultural land is still a concern of mine. But the reason I wanted to share this is just if we look at the land that's left to agriculture in New York State in the last 25 years, it's over 1.2 million acres. And, you know, pre-2017, or even really pre-2022, we cannot attribute very much of that land loss at all to solar, right? It's only been in the last 5 years or so, and even then the numbers are of acres in solar in the state are relatively small compared to what we've lost to other forms of development, and since the effectively since the turn of the century. So I think that's important to think about, because what I like to focus on is how this impacts our our most productive agricultural land, not necessarily all of our agricultural land. And the reason being that protecting our most productive land is going to give our farms the best competitive advantage and also have the most environmental benefits. As if we're producing food on our more productive land, it allows us to use our less productive land for other uses. So just sharing a few numbers and perspective there. So all right, let's see. Now I gotta be able to. So Lewis County is a rural county in northern New York, defined by the dairy industry. We like to say that there's more cows than people in the county, which is a true statement. It's not just a tagline; it's a true statement. And our legacy industries have been agriculture and the paper industry, and they've struggled over the years, and we've essentially lost a lot of our paper industry. So there's a general support for renewable energy in the county, starting with the first wind farm that was developed in 2005, and continuing with more wind farm development and solar. Um, and essentially, as a rural county, our past economic health was based on our natural resources, and our future economic health is going to be based on our natural resources. So, and using those for renewable energy is one opportunity, but also, we shouldn't be doing that, in my opinion, anyways, at the cost of our other industries that rely on those same natural resources. So it's finding some of that balance. And quite frankly, as an area that lost the paper industry around the turn of the century and has really struggled like a lot of rural parts of the US, the development of these energy projects has really been an infusion of funds into the area that's been beneficial, especially as we've lost other tax base. And part of that has been the pilots, the payment in lieu of taxes that developers often seek to go along with to provide a stable tax base for their projects. And that's where generally there's a couple different ways you can get pilots, but generally developers look to the IDAs as a mechanism to get those. And so we've had pilot agreements on all of our wind projects going back to the first one in 2005. But one challenge related to that is there's kind of been a growing discrepancy in the county between the townships and the school districts in the county that are receiving these pilot agreements and those that are not. And on top of that, it becomes a challenge when you have all this pilot money coming in to manage it against your tax base, against your tax caps. And I like a quote that a colleague of mine shared with me that don't buy or don't use grant money to buy groceries. So in other words, we view this pilot money, the money from these wind or energy projects as something we should use that's extra money. It shouldn't be used to artificially keep our tax base low, because I'll share in a minute, that's just kind of going to come back to bite us later. But if we can use it to develop infrastructure, to invest in other ways in the county to grow our tax base so that we have a rebuilt tax base after these energy projects potentially go away, then that can be a lot better use of the money and have a lot longer term benefits. And I just threw this in here about 10 minutes ago, and I hesitated a little bit because I had just read it, but I was reviewing my email from the day and came across this article that was in Morning Ag Clips. And it really struck me because I don't know the numbers. I want to go back and calculate the numbers for Lewis County now. But I would say that the sentiments here are very much what we've experienced in Lewis County, in terms of it really brought some stabilization to our local economy at a time when, again, we were losing the paper industry, and the agriculture is always kind of a roller coaster ride economically. So I'm curious to look at our renewable energy portfolio now from this perspective. But I'm guessing it will be a not insignificant percentage of our county's tax revenue, as this example indicates. So with this and with knowing that developers are interested in pilots, um, we were looking at ways to incentivize the use of marginal farmland and keep projects off, especially solar projects that take up more land off of our prime farmland. So our mechanism for doing this was setting a pilot schedule where the maximum amount that you'd have to pay for your payment in lieu of taxes would be if you were using prime agricultural soils and actively farm land. And then we could offer discounts to that pilot based on our policy for using marginal land or idle land. We started this out at 5,500 a megawatt based on these older figures from NYSERDA of us being in the national grid area. So we looked at it and said, all right, the high end of their spectrum's 5,100. We'll set it at 55, and then that'll hopefully catch people's attention and want to look for marginal farmland so they can get the discounts to back that number down. I'll say that our experience was no one blinked an eye at 5,500. So we've now raised it to 7,500. We can, if you get all the discounts for bringing it back down on marginal land that's not being used for agriculture, you can still bring that number back down to, 3,500, 4,000 or so. And I'd have to say that even still at 7,500, some developers have grumbled a little bit about that, but I'm not aware of it actually stopping a project from going through. So here's how we do it. We send the project map to our Soil and Water Conservation District office, and they use the USDA prime farmland numbers and analyze the project footprint and essentially give us a discount schedule. So we start with the 7,500. In this case, it was 100% of the array was on actively farmed land, so they didn't get any discount there. But about 27% of the land was not prime, so they got the 30% discount just on that 27% of the land. So that drops the pilot for this particular project down from 7,500 a megawatt down to 6,888 a megawatt. So that, it's a straightforward process. It's right in our pilot documents, so everyone's very clear on what the process is. And we use the USDA data, so there's no kind of question if it's prime land or not. We're just using their definitions of that, and it's worked pretty well from that standpoint. What I would say is it hasn't really worked all that well in actually deterring projects from going on prime farmland. To be, perfectly straightforward about it, we get more money in the pilot when it goes on prime farmland, but we haven't really experienced where it stopped a project from going on prime farmland. And some of the reasons for that we've learned, and maybe we should have known up front, but we learn as we go, is even though the pilot seems like a significant amount of money on some of these larger projects, proportionally it tends to still be a smaller expense. So the savings that a developer can get through our discount schedule for using marginal land may be relatively small versus the added cost they would incur for moving the project. Another thing that I think is important in talking to farmers is soil type isn't the only attribute for marginal versus kind of prime or optimum farmland. Here's just an example I pulled up. So this big rectangular square rectangular field up here is the same soil type as these little odd shaped fields back here. But to a farmer, this large rectangular field that's right on the road is much easier to access, much more efficient to operate in, brings a lot more efficiencies to it than these little odd shaped ones that are way back off the road and hard to get to. So we have to, keep those sort of things in mind as well. as these are harder, these are a little more of a judgment call where soil type is very defined by USDA, but but it is a factor when we think about how these a farm might think about the utilization of these fields. So if spend just a minute on a traditional pilot, the idea with pilots is for like say a factory is expanding in your county, is to build them up to the full tax rate over maybe 10 or 15 years. So when the pilot ends, they are on the tax rolls at the full rate, and the community receives that money. The Pilots for energy tend to be kind of the opposite, or at least we don't really know what happens after the energy project decommissions. Um, because these pilots tend to have it start out at essentially 100% and have an escalator in them over 20 to 30 years. And then if the project was decommissioned at the end of that, all that pilot revenue goes away. It doesn't get turned over to the tax rolls as a full tax project. And because we have a wind farm that's 20 years old now, that's what some of our municipalities are facing, is especially if they've kept taxes artificially low over that 20-year period. There's just no way they can bring their tax rate up in any sort of timely manner that's not going to be a total shock to their residents if the project gets decommissioned. One thing we've done in working with taxing jurisdictions and developers on this is actually front loaded the pilots so that the escalator for the first 10 or so years is higher. And then there's actually a de-escalator for later in the project. This can help the taxing jurisdictions kind of wean off of that revenue and adjust their tax rates. And then also, we've experienced a fairly positive feedback from developers from the perspective that they tend to have higher maintenance cost and maybe lower energy efficient production efficiency as the project gets older, or they have to retool the project and put new materials in there. So if they can have a slightly lower cost at later in the project, there's some potential benefits there as well. So that's one thing we've looked at. But the larger thing we've looked at is that we've really asked the question, is pilot really the best place for this revenue to go into the community? Or are host community benefit agreements a way that entities, affected jurisdictions within the county can negotiate for revenue from the project and perhaps have more flexibility in how that revenue gets used in their communities to help build their communities up without it being counted as tax revenue. And essentially, the way we look at it is there's a total pie that the developer is looking to spend. And so it's up to us to work together as a community to first maximize the total size of that pie, and then decide behind the scenes how that pie will be split up to best suit the community. What portion of it might go in a pilot versus a host community agreement? Who will have that host community agreement, and so on. So there's other factors that go into this too, right? How much the landowner is getting for lease, special district taxes, road maintenance agreements, zoning requirements that add cost to the project. They all may also affect the size of that pie, right? But if we get there, then we can have a good conversation about how the money can best utilize the community, or best be utilized in the community. So an example of this in Lewis County is our Lewis County Development Corporation negotiated a host community agreement with a wind farm that went in recently. And here's the wind farm, the size of it, the pilot agreement, which is split. Again, one thing I didn't mention, pilot revenue is split between the affected taxing jurisdictions, typically the county, town, and school district, based on tax rates. or traditionally based on tax rates, they can agree to deviate from that if they want. And then on top of that, in this case, the our Lewis County Development Corporation negotiated a host community agreement on behalf of the entire county of 150 per year for 30 years with a 1.5% escalator in it. And through this was created the Lewis County Community Economic Development Program, where there's an independent board of people that review applications and are set up in grant programs of different for different focuses. An independent group of people from the county, volunteers from the county, sit on this committee um, to review these applications and award the grants each year. And these fund, and they also over time may decide to shift these 5 buckets that the money goes into or create new ones depending on what the needs of the county are. Um, and we plan to use this approach for all. We're currently negotiating, or not we, but the Lewis County Development Corporation is currently negotiating this with a few solar projects that are potentially coming to the county as well. It's really set a good precedent for how we can work together and use that money to build our tax base again. No offense to the local cemetery or the local playground. I mean, they may be very good projects that help with the community and are needed, but we're really setting our sights on projects that are going to have a long-lasting impact on our tax base and the viability of our communities through the use of this money. And so another thing I'd mention, so individual towns can negotiate these as well. One thing we've run into with individual towns negotiating these is having the capacity to administer the funds and have this sort of strategic vision. So we found that it's been beneficial to host this through our economic development office, where they have the capacity to administer the program on behalf of the development corporation. We do have a few towns that are interested in one of the solar projects and in negotiating their own host community benefit agreement outside of the one that our development corporation negotiates. But actually, they're still talking to our county's uh, economic development office about administering the program for them. So the funds in that case would be dedicated just to that township, not the whole county, but they would still look to have our economic development group administer them, help with that strategic visioning of how to use them. Because, let's face it, sometimes in our smaller rural towns where we have volunteers on a board and maybe no full-time staff, it can be another task to try to administer these sort of things that it isn't always real feasible. So we found this approach to work well for us. Back to agriculture, because we started these with wind projects and the wind projects don't have a large footprint relative to ag land, we didn't specifically pull out agriculture. Some of these grant programs that are listed here, we have farmers that apply for them. They're eligible to apply. They've received them and purchased stuff for their farm businesses through these grants, but none of them are specific to ag at this point. We're currently strategizing on how to change that as we get revenue from solar projects, because they have such a large impact on land use, unlike the wind projects have. And there are some definite differences there. So some of the things we've looked at is, we have yield indexes to look at soil productivity. And if a farm loses highly productive soil and has to move, rent land that's 2 miles further down the road, that's a less productive soil, and maybe they have to, rent 110 acres to make up for the 100 acres they lost, or they could enhance that land through tile drainage to bring up the productivity to match the productivity of the land they lost to the project. Those sort of things that we're looking at potentially opening up more of these funds specific to agriculture, given the land use competition factor. So that's what I had for you, and hopefully I didn't take too much time, Guillermo, but we can. I think we're gonna do the Q&A at the end, maybe. But I can take questions now if there's time.
Yeah, no, I think we're good. There's a couple things in the chat, but we're going to I think we're going to hold off on those. And there was a concern about your volume being low, but I think that kind of adjusted pretty quickly, so we didn't address that. But yeah, we'll address those at the end, and I think we're going to go ahead and jump to Christie's slides, which unfortunately we had a technical issue, so I'll be advancing those. But Christie, just let me know when you want to advance, and let me get that up and running right now. Hang on. Okay, let's present. Come on. There we go. All right. Just let me know. Thanks.
Great. So thank you, Guillermo, and thank you, Joe. Joe did a great job talking about the difference between pilots and community benefits agreements, and I'm going to spend some time really focusing more on community benefits agreements as we go through my deck. Just to, you can go to the next slide, Guillermo. Just to provide a definition that everyone can understand, a community benefits agreement is a legally binding contract between a project developer and community stakeholders or local government, under which the developer agrees to provide specific community benefits in return for a commitment from stakeholders to support or not oppose the project. This is important to understand because having a community benefits agreement, even one that's legally binding, that's been negotiated with a developer, and has been ratified, is not necessarily mean that any of the benefits will come back to the community if the project is not permitted. So this process is irrespective of the permitting process. It is something that takes place outside of that, and the preparation also exists outside of the permitting process. The other thing that I want to point out is that a pilot agreement can be negotiated, and a CBA can be negotiated. So they are separate equity distribution tools that can both provide value to your community. Next slide, please. So one of the things that community benefits agreements has really become important in how we cite and permit projects is that oftentimes when you go to a public hearing to learn more about a project that's being considered in your community, the one thing that's heard most among county commissioners is, what's in this for us? Why does the community want this project? You know, and many times they see projects more as a negative to their community. And the community benefits agreement helps provide a way to provide the community voice into the decision-making process. And it also provides the return on investment back to the community for the extraction that the developer is taking from the land in order to generate more power. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the power that's generated in the community does not go directly to the community. In other cases, that ask becomes ingrained in a community benefits agreement, meaning that there are times in large projects for very large communities that there's an opportunity to create a microgrid that does allow power to come back into the community. But irrespective of that, there are other long-term benefits that communities can ask for and that are important to the community to consider. So if you could think about the process of a community benefits agreement, the entire process is about, you know, ensuring that the community has tangible, lasting benefits that go the long term of the project. The other important aspect is that it addresses the community concerns, the what's in it for us. It provides revenue for needs that the community, not the local elected officials, identify, but the community identify. And sometimes they're in alignment, and sometimes they're completely different, depending on at what time and when those asks are made. So there could be times when infrastructure is an area that may be underfunded in the community, or there could be healthcare needs that arise, or there could be park renewal or other services that the community is seeking that may, again, not be initially priorities for the local government. The other part of this is that a community benefits agreement is really the partnership. It's the partnership between the stakeholders and the developer. And it provides that formality that's really important to say we support or not oppose your project. Is everything okay before I go on? Are we good, Guillermo?
Yes, sorry. Folks out there were just seeing the presentation mode. Not the, I don't know why it's not now letting me do it. Sorry, please continue it if you can while I
Sure.
figure this out.
And then the other really important piece of a community benefits agreement is the process that is used to determine the needs and priorities of the community must be inclusive. And you want as many folks in your community to weigh in on this process. If you are thinking about who should weigh in or how you consider inclusivity, we're saying right now at least 10%. So at least 10% of your adult population and community and adolescents, and I'll get to that in a minute, should have an opportunity to weigh in on a project and discuss, if they were to accept a project in their community, what they want their community to look like in terms of additional benefits that they would receive from saying yes to this project. And lastly, the other really important piece. So community benefit agreements are really new in renewable energy. They've been around for a long time in the fossil fuel industry, but are less known in the renewable space. And part of that is their communities just weren't really making the ask and understanding that they can make this ask. And community-based organizations especially did not realize the power that they hold in being able to negotiate for benefits directly with developers. But ultimately, the CBA process provides the social license to operate in a community. It's the agreement that goes back to the long-term partnership that's needed to really embrace the project and see it as part of developing the community and providing resilience over the long-term horizon of the project. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take everybody through the entire process of what a community benefits agreement would look like, and how that process is kind of unfolds in a very broad strokes. It starts out with identifying who your community is that you want to be talking to. And by that, I mean reaching out to disadvantaged groups that traditionally are underrepresented in many of the decision-making that happens at the local government level. So you want to go into your youth centers, you want to go to PTA meetings, you want to go into your EJ communities, either in your community or within the region. You want to go into different spaces and places to reach people and make sure, again, that they have full buy-in into this process. Once you establish who your audience is and who you're going to be reaching out to, you want to be thinking about how you're going to reach out to them. So we always recommend going in with multiple modes of communication over a several month period of time. So we start off with a broad survey. Generally, we want to get as much participation using that survey as we can that's tailored to a particular county or community. And then from there, we generally parse out and create smaller focus group opportunities where we bring those ideas to a smaller group and get additional information as to whether or not these are representative of the group and where they would prioritize the needs that come out of the survey. Additionally, we do many interviews. And I mean, this process can be, depending on the size of the project, it could be vast in terms of how many people you want to connect with to get their buy-in and their to evaluate where they are on this project in terms of how that fits into what they see for their community. So once we get to having completed the focus group period, we often have a smaller advisory council, and that advisory council is made up of members within the community, and they're responsible for helping to set those priorities, prepare that wish list, if you will, of items that would be potentially negotiated with a developer depending on project size. We recommend, and I'm going to get to this more later, but we always recommend having this process started and underway before a project even comes into your community, because the process can take so long to actually get to a place of agreement. It's really important to start it in as early as possible. The other piece of this that can accelerate the community engagement process is having a needs assessment, and needs assessments cost money. So in smaller communities, we often recommend going to your comp plans or your economic development plans as a start place. And in some other communities, you can go to your community-based organizations that may have already done some of this legwork for you. So when you're starting off, you have those documents in place that can help guide the community engagement listening process. Once you have a developer come in with a project, you then take all the information that you've gathered from the community, and the advisory council would then work together to come up with a defined list of requests that they're going to make to the developer, and begin the drafting and negotiation process. The drafting and negotiation process can move quickly depending on the size of the project and the complexity of your request. Oftentimes it goes back and forth several times, but eventually it gets to a finalized agreement in most cases. And then the responsibility of the community-based organization or the advisory commission, with the assistance of the municipality that would help administer and enforce the agreement, would start to move forward only when the project is permitted, which also ensures that the agreement moves forward as well. And the other aspect of a community benefits agreement that's really important is making sure that not only is enforcement in place to hold the developer accountable to the promises made in the agreement, but also evaluating the outcomes. You know, did the community receive the benefit that they expected? Did it lead to the outcome that was anticipated? And that is important. So when you enter into your next agreement, you have the ability to evaluate how to do things differently and maybe where to make changes in the process. Next slide, please. So again, I started off saying that, you know, when and how should communities engage? The when part is really important. We're talking to counties and municipalities across the country right now who are expiring their moratoria or bans or discussing what their policies would be for the very first time. And as they're considering making those policy changes, we are also talking to them about organizing your group, organizing and identifying your community-based organization, organizing your advisory council, considering who would be that point person, whether the county would play a role or not in the process, or whether we'd be wholly separate, driven through the community-based organization and directly through the developer. So we highly recommend that if anybody is thinking about engaging in this process and hasn't been doing work in this area, starting conversations now, if this is something that you're considering or would like to see come into your community, would be extremely advantageous to ensure the process goes smoothly later on. And then what constitutes effective engagement? So again, forming a local coalition or some sort of advisory council, absent having a community-based organization that represents the community holistically, not just from one perspective, is really an important aspect to making sure that there are a set of decision makers that have been identified in the community that are working on behalf of the community and become well known in the community that they're leading this effort. Reaching out to developers early. As soon as a project comes into your community and is announced or is part of a docket on a public hearing, or if you even hear of a developer buying land in the community or making lease agreements, with landowners, that is the time to start engaging with them. And many times developers will want that type of engagement, and they will want to hear from you. So do not be afraid to reach out to developers early and start building a relationship. Additionally, showing up and speaking up, making sure that, community members can ask questions at public hearings, can maintain, a pulse as to what development may be coming into the community. Making sure that there is that symbiotic communication on all fronts, I think, is very important, both from the local government's perspective as well as the community's perspective, and making sure that efforts aren't duplicated but are aligned and harmonized as the process moves forward. Next slide, please. So the representation that is part of your advisory council and through your community engagement process is really important in ensuring that your community benefits agreement does represent the needs of the community. And that is so important because there have been many times when a local government will engage in a community benefits agreement, and sometimes the community feels like it was negotiated behind closed doors, if you will. And when that happens, the community often lashes back. So the next time a project comes around and they feel as though their voice wasn't part of the discussion or was not heard, or a group was not heard, that raises the risk of local opposition that could squelch future projects, and also places the local government in a sideways position sometimes with the community. So making sure that you create a system or a process, and developers will lean on, in many cases, local officials to help guide them through this process and make sure that if they are the ones handling the community engagement process, and sometimes they are, that they have and that they are going to you and you're helping them achieve a diverse group of representation, people at the table that can help drive this process forward in an equitable way. The other thing that's really important is to have clear purpose and shared goals. So this is where the needs assessment comes in, or your comp plan comes in, where you provide resources or technical support sometimes to your advisory council or to your community-based organization. So everyone understands where the county or the municipality is currently, both in terms of economically and workforce development and infrastructure investment, education investment, et cetera. The other thing that's really important is that the whole entire process, you want to see this to be as organized and coordinated as possible. And again, this goes back to communication, being transparent between the local government and what you are negotiating, if it's separate from what a community-based organization or the community is negotiating. And all of this ties into creating greater credibility and influence for the long term, both with a developer who sees alignment and sees solidarity between the community and the decision makers, but also in terms of influencing the best outcome and the most money or return on investment to the community. Next slide, please. So what can communities gain? So this is the fun part. There's a number of ways in which investment can come back into the community. It can come back into direct payments. Pilots is one mechanism that can be achieved. It can be and should be over the life of the project. Infrastructure investments, a lot of times we see a request around emergency services, particularly fire and EMS for battery storage. It's been it's one that continues to pop. Jobs and economic opportunity, local hiring. People want to know what economic benefits that come back into the community, and training programs to create long-term employment opportunities, particularly for agrarian communities that are seeing a shift or a transition in their economies. And of course, environmental protection, working a lot in the Midwest. There's a lot of concern around wildlife preservation. And so that often is an issue in those communities that rises to the top. And schools, of course, everyone wants to be able to ensure that their schools are well funded. And the other thing that is coming up too a bit more recently is park improvements or park renewal opportunities. But really the sky's the limit, and you should not hamstring or set restrictions or limitations on what a community benefits agreement could include. It truly should be based on how the community defines their needs. And in some cases, none of these that I've outlined here will be the thing that the community most wants. Sometimes, a community may just want a nurse, a remote nurse that comes into the community to do preventative healthcare and is mobile. I've seen that come up as well. So really important to kind of think broadly and to support the community as best you can, and ensuring that there are needs that are being heard and addressed in the community benefits agreement. Next slide, please. So this is a fun one that I wanted to kind of bring to everyone's attention, because people don't think, a solar developer can actually create a skate park. They can, and they did. And although I didn't work on this particular CBA, I thought it was really important because, again, this particular example represents that you should try to reach as many stakeholders in your community as possible. And in many cases, I've seen community-based organizations negate youth in terms of who their stakeholders are. They're just not they're not on their list. And in this case, thankfully, this group of teenagers continued to show up at their public hearings and public forums, and they succeeded in getting a skate park in their community that was paid for by the solar developer. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. And lastly, and I know Matthew will go into this a bit more, but the top 5 pitfalls to avoid in CBAs: skipping the legal review. Your legal review, I always say, it's always good to get as you're going through the negotiation process before you get to the end, that you have an attorney review your request, your ask, and kind of walk you through whether or not these comport with how you're going to be able to receive the money and use the funds. Vague language and broken promises. If you're asking for job training, be specific on what job training you want, how many people you're expecting to be trained, and who should be receiving that training. If you're asking for jobs, then you want to make sure that there's a number tied to that the developer is held accountable for. Any way you can quantify or qualify any of your asks, it goes a long way ensuring that there's no ambiguity over time. Because remember, these documents are meant to last the life of the project, which can be 25 years or roughly. And excluding community voices, we kind of talked about that with the youth example, but there are other voices that are often marginalized and sometimes silenced or not part of the conversation. I'm working in a community right now that has a very large Latino community that we're having difficulty because there's a lack of trust that's inherent in the community, and finding different ways to reach out to them. And it's really important for us to kind of figure out how to make those connections. And I encourage creativity in all ways to get as many people at the table. Taking one-time payments. I just saw this on a gigawatt project that was cited, and a community-based organization said they wanted piano lessons. So we don't recommend those types of one-time payments. These are opportunities for you to catalyze economic development in your community. And so we want you to aim high and think more broadly about what the return could be. And lastly, no monitoring or enforcement. I think it's really critical that the local government can play a strong role on the enforcement side. For very small rural communities, that is probably the best opportunity for you to ensure strong enforcement and mitigation and remediation help. You can also, if you're in good, the local government also could play a really great role in monitoring for you. So, and the community-based organization can uphold the administration of the process. They can uphold the money and make sure the money is spent appropriately. So there can be a joint process that's shared that makes most sense to address what is needed to ensure that the agreements are upheld. One last thing that's not part of my slides that Guillermo asked me to discuss. A community benefits agreement, the timeline, when you can expect to receive the benefits from the community. Right now, we are in a very different and changing environment in terms of how monies can flow in for a process like this. So for example, many communities across the country right now struggle with technical advisory services to do this type of work, to understand how to set these up and what the benefits could look like, and providing legal enforcement. And we have started asking developers as part of a community benefits agreement to help us provide those technical assistance and services to communities so we can stand them up to be able to do this process, to be able to do that negotiation. This is new, and it's new because philanthropic monies are running dry. There's very little resources in this space right now to be able to do this type of work. And there are opportunities to ask for this as part of your community benefits agreement. If you were to ask developers earlier about helping to fund that technical advisory services, that can be written in, and that can be something that could be obtained by the community before you actually get to a complete agreement or before the project's even permitted. So it's a new ask that's kind of coming online, and in under-resourced communities, it's a good ask to start making, particularly when a developer comes into your community. The traditional community benefits agreements, however, do take time for benefits to materialize. Again, after an agreement is signed, the project still needs to be permitted, and that permitting process can take time. Once that permitting process is completed, the developer then needs to go into an interconnection queue and make sure that they can actually, once a project goes through construction, connect to the grid. That can take several years. And construction, depending on the size of the project, can take several months and up to a year or more. So it can take time before you start to see benefits coming back into your community. And once they start coming in, depending on how your agreement is set up, they may not be coming in terms of a lump sum until there's a revenue share that happens, or it can be something that starts coming in immediately. But it is a long-term process. And another reason to think critically about your ask in terms of your overall investment for your community. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Well, thank you. And I'll pull up my slides.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. As Guillermo mentioned at the outset, my name is Matt Eisenson. I'm a lawyer by training. I was previously at the New York Attorney General's office in the Environmental Protection Bureau for about 4.5 years before I joined the Sabin Center. And I've been at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia for a little over 3 years now, where I lead a project that's focused on studying local opposition to renewable energy facilities and solutions for working through that opposition. And one of the areas of research has been community benefits agreements. As Christie mentioned, a community benefits agreement is at its essence a binding contract between a developer on one side and either a local government or community-based groups on the other side. And I'm going to focus in my talk on some considerations that would go into the drafting of that contract. But first, for a little bit of background, one of the things that Christie said in her presentation was, to reach out to developers. They want to hear from you. And this is totally true. And I want to give you a little bit of perspective on what developers might be thinking about community benefit agreements now. So there was a survey and report released by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, January 2024. The Berkeley Lab researchers interviewed about 120 developers of large-scale wind and solar projects, and they asked them a series of questions about, how well are your projects going? How many of your projects are being canceled or delayed? What's causing these delays? And what they found was that, at least 30% of wind and solar projects were being canceled during the siting phase, which was costing developers a lot of money. The siting phase is often multiple years into the process after many different studies have been done, like interconnection studies and a lot of planning. And this is a big problem that developers want to avoid. When the Berkeley Lab researchers asked developers, what's driving these cancellations, the three main causes were local ordinances or zoning, grid interconnection, and community opposition. So the first and third of those are, directly related to what's going on at the local level. Local ordinances from local governments that, aren't favorable to wind or solar, or community opposition. When researchers asked the developers, are there any options for getting around, this opposition, and what is most feasible? Developers identified community benefits agreements as, by far the most feasible of the sort of out of the box options. About, 83% of developers thought that community benefits agreements, were at least somewhat feasible, compared to 11% who found community ownership feasible, and a similarly tiny percentage who found electricity bill discounts to be feasible. So developers view CBAs as a fairly feasible tool for getting around or working through community opposition. And then, finally, at the level of the general public, the idea of a community benefits agreement that, mitigates local impacts has fairly widespread appeal. And in a survey by World Resources Institute, huge majorities of respondents from all political parties were at least somewhat supportive of the idea of CBAs. So at the Sabin Center, I mentioned we've done some research on community benefits agreements. We have two main, outputs. One was a guide on best practices for community benefits agreements. This guide identifies, 35 enumerated recommendations. Some of them are geared toward developers. What should developers be doing? Some toward host communities, and then some are sort of general principles of drafting and negotiation. We also maintain a database with real examples of community benefits agreements from various contexts, including the renewable energy context and other contexts like, entertainment. This is just an example of what our database actually looks like. So we have a host community agreement for the Medway Battery Energy Storage System in Medway, Massachusetts. And if you go to our database, you can download the actual agreement and see some of the key details about it summarized. In putting together our best practices guide on expert insights on negotiating and drafting community benefits agreements, we interviewed over a dozen experts from across the country, and these were primarily lawyers who had negotiated multiple community benefits agreements. And the lawyers were based in the states that you see here: New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, California, Colorado, and Texas. And we found that CBAs are much more common in some parts of the countries, like the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and the West. And the experts we spoke with in Texas hadn't heard of CBAs, but they had worked on similar agreements through settlements. So I'll go pretty quickly through some of the best practices here. This is a few of our best practices for developers, just to give you a sense of the things we're recommending developers do. And it's very similar to some of the stuff that Christie was talking about. We recommend they hire a local outreach firm. If developers are working to negotiate a CBA with the local government, it's fairly obvious who they should be speaking with. But if they're looking to negotiate with community-based groups, it's really not very obvious if you're not from the area, and often they're from out of town. And we recommend that developers start with conversations rather than deals, and that they frame the discussions around mitigation rather than, what can we do to buy support? The developer should be saying, we recognize that this project will have impacts. Some of the impacts would be adverse impacts, and what could we do to mitigate those impacts? We recommend that developers engage with local officials early and often, that they meet one-on-one with neighbors, even if the neighbors are opponents. And nobody likes meeting with opponents. And developers are humans too, and they have a tendency to just want to meet with their local supporters. But neighbors of the project are the ones who are most affected. They're very angry if developers don't meet with them, and developers just have to do it. They have to have these meetings. We recommend that developers take community members and local government officials on tours of comparable facilities. And, we recommend that you, as, local government officials, ask for those tours. And then we also recommend, CBAs often have monetary terms and non-monetary terms. We recommend that the developer, try to work out all of the non-monetary benefits before agreeing to an amount of monetary benefits. And the reason for that is the non-monetary benefits can be extremely expensive to the developer. And the developer really needs to nail those down before they can figure out what they can really afford. In our recommendations for host communities, again, a lot of overlap with Christie here. We recommend that host communities ask the developer for information about their other facilities and affiliates. So developers should be providing all the information about their violation history and other facilities to local governments. They should be providing information about, what community benefits have they promised in other instances and what have they delivered. You should ask developers for all the information about the site. Have they done any environmental studies? Have they discovered any environmental issues that, could raise concerns about contamination once they start working? You should hire a technical expert and ask the developer to pay for it. And it's possible that they will. They do agree to that in many instances. And also you should hire counsel if you can. That's a bigger issue for community-based groups. Local governments have, the county attorney or whoever it may be. Then when it gets to drafting, there are a few general principles. Number one, a CBA is extremely customizable. It's a contract, and you can really put in almost anything. I'll talk about some of the limits later, but the benefits should really be tailored to community needs and priorities, and to the greatest extent possible, they should be benefits that mitigate any negative impacts from the facility. And there's a legal reason for this in addition to a practical one, which I'll discuss. Number two, they should avoid ambiguity. Christie mentioned this one too, but one particular reason to avoid ambiguity is that it's very difficult to enforce an ambiguous provision, almost impossible. And so, if there's a really key provision in a contract that you may later want to enforce, it really needs to be drafted clearly. Mandate a schedule for review of the application if the local government's reviewing it. This is really important, particularly for developers, because a CBA is, as a contract, each side gives some sort of consideration. There's an almost unlimited number of benefits that a developer can offer, but on the community side, it's usually just, an agreement not to oppose a project or an agreement to support it. One other thing that community groups or local governments can offer, local governments in particular can offer, is to agree to a schedule for review of the application to make sure it doesn't drag on for years and years. CBA should include provisions for amendment and renewal, and we have examples of these in our database. They should also include mechanisms for monitoring compliance and enforcement. One of the questions that I get a lot is whether CBAs are enforceable. They are absolutely enforceable. They are binding contracts, and the way to enforce a contract is to bring a lawsuit for breach of contract. The problems for enforcement are much more, number one, will you know if there's a breach? And number two, it's expensive to bring a lawsuit for breach of contract. So, on the question of, will you know if there's a breach, for some types of provisions, like a payment provision, it's fairly obvious. A payment was due and it wasn't paid. That's a breach. You can bring the lawsuit. For other types of provisions, like environmental monitoring, it can be much more difficult. And so, it can be worthwhile to include, provisions for, how the monitoring is supposed to look and whether there's going to be a third party doing it or a government agency involved. And then if I can dig into a few legal principles and things to watch out for. One of the big things to figure out is who are the parties to the agreement. And this matters for practical reasons, but also for legal reasons. In terms of legal reasons, there's a legal principle called privity of contract. And what this means is that only the parties to a contract are bound by it and can enforce it. So if you as a local government are, trying to decide whether or not to join a CBA that a community-based group is, negotiating. One of the things you might think about is, would this community-based group really have the wherewithal to enforce it? And if they wouldn't, then it could be worth, participating in the agreement so that you could enforce it. Another really important thing is that the agreement should specify that it binds, not just the current developer, but any successors of the developer. Sometimes these projects change hands. A developer might build a facility, but then immediately sell it to somebody else. And the agreement needs to make clear that the agreement runs with the project and any successors to the developer or assigns. We have an example of what some of this successors and interest language would look like in our CBA database. This is an example from the Wright Solar PV project, which you can find on our database. Now, special considerations for CBAs involving government entities. So as I mentioned at the outset, there are essentially two forms of CBAs. There's a private CBA between a developer and a community-based group, and a public CBA or host community agreement between a developer and a local government entity. There are a few special considerations when a government entity is involved, and they generally revolve around a body of case law concerning exactions and unconstitutional conditions. In the CBA context, this is still largely theoretical. We haven't seen lawsuits about this, but there's Supreme Court precedent to be aware of. So, the Supreme Court precedent basically says that local governments can impose conditions on project approvals, and these conditions are called exactions. But these exactions need to meet two requirements. They need to meet the nexus requirement, and that means that the benefit exacted from the development must have an essential nexus to the legitimate state interest that the local government would have invoked to prohibit the development. So, Christie talked about how you can have a CBA that creates a skate park. And, you absolutely can, but, if a local government is involved, this is the kind of thing where, if a developer objected to the demand that, it build a skate park, it could say, look, there's no essential nexus between, my solar farm and a skate park, which could be an issue. The second requirement is proportionality. And this is that the benefit needs to be roughly proportional to the impact of the development. I think, I mentioned that these are sort of theoretical concerns, and it's the kind of thing that a county attorney might be concerned about. But I think an important thing to bear in mind is that, our courts in the US aren't going out looking for cases. They're only deciding the cases and controversies that have been, properly filed before them. And so you really have to ask yourself, who's going to bring the lawsuit? If a developer is approaching a town and saying, I would like to build you a skate park, is the developer going to turn around and file a lawsuit saying, I'm not sure there's an essential nexus between my project and a skate park? But this is something that your county attorney would want to work through if you were directly involved, and particularly if you have any sort of approval authority over the project. None of this really comes into play if you have a state permitting process in place, and then the local governments are just negotiating a host community agreement with the developer as a matter of good faith. And this is, something that happens a lot in New York, where large-scale renewables are adjudicated and permitted at the state level. But it's very common for developers to, enter into host community agreements with town governments, and the town governments, agree as part of that process not to intervene in opposition to a project. And that sort of arrangement wouldn't raise any of these, constitutional concerns. It's much more if the town is the permitting authority and is also insisting on, various benefits as part of the permitting process. last, Christie's talked about all sorts of benefits, and Joe has as well talked about, the relationship between, host community agreement benefits and pilot agreement benefits. I just wanted to point out that there are a few different ways to structure these, and you can see the examples in our database. So this is the South Ripley Solar Project, which is 270 megawatts of solar plus storage. The benefit provisions do some things that you'll see in a lot of other agreements. They tie the amount of the benefit to an amount per megawatt of nameplate capacity. There is this provision to increase the benefits year over year. And in this instance, the town has complete discretion over how the benefits are used. To give a different example of how benefits can be used, the Kahana Solar Project in Maui has an arrangement where there is $55,000 of funding per year, and one portion of that, this $40,000 proportion, is allocated at the discretion of the company, and then the other $15,000 is allocated at the discretion of the Hawaii Community Foundation. These are very flexible, and there are many different ways to do benefits. I'm going to stop there, and we can open it up for questions.
All right, thank you very much. That was great. Yeah, a lot of nuance. We do have some questions. Some have been answered in the chat. So folks want to, if you posted a question in the chat, you'll see that Joe has addressed some of those. But I'll rewind to some of the early ones. Thank you all for all of that. As BESS or battery energy storage systems portions of co-located projects get larger, how are they calculated into the pilot and or host community benefit agreement formula? And I'll just throw out that in my understanding, there's two ways to do pilots and host community benefit agreements, and that's by for solar projects. That's by acreage or by megawatts. And on the BESS side, it's obviously not by acreage, so it's basically on the power storage capacity. But Joe or anyone else want to add to that? Not hearing anything. Joe's back. I don't know if you've encountered any battery energy storage systems into your pilots.
No, we haven't at this point. It's actually been a point of discussion and something that our staff has been looking into, because we've had a few developers contact the IDA office regarding it. So yeah, it's an open question for us too, but I'm not aware of that we've really come to any answers on it.
Okay, thanks. Just running down the questions, they're going to be all over the place, but is there a hard copy of the PowerPoint? So yes, there's going to be, this will be posted to the website that I put at the top of the chat, and I can repost that again if you missed it. And basically, the other three in the series have been posted there already, and this one will go up as soon as we're able to download it and get it over to our to our YouTube site. So I'll send a link out to anyone who's registered. So all the participants here and anyone else who wasn't able to join us but registered will get that link. And as I said, all four will eventually be up there. For Christie, can you provide examples of the process in New York towns with less than 5,000 people, and how did they afford such an effort?
So I don't have a New York example, but in Colorado right now, we are roughly just over 5,000, and we're requesting funding now from the developer, and unable to get any additional funding from the federal government that was providing funding, and then going to various philanthropic sources and not being able to get resources. We have made the ask of the developer to help fund this process.
And I will reiterate, so you also said that you're able to get some of the funding up ahead of time in the process, even before the permitting, even before the building, construction, all of that. So that is part of what developers are used to doing anyway, with like environmental impact studies, There are some fees that they will pay the county or town lawyer to review projects. So all of that is stuff that they do pay some things even before the project launches or is fully, active, even if it never becomes fully online. So
And
adding
just
this in may not, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and why they do that is because it creates greater certainty for them. So they
Mhm.
want a process that runs smoothly. And so if they can provide those resources up front, it saves them oftentimes downstream cost in trying to engage in this process on their own or having a process that isn't well organized. So they are starting to come around and wanting to help provide this additional funding for these communities that are on the smaller side or even mid-size actually, to help prop up community-based organizations or communities that engage in these processes.
Mhm. Great. On the topic of what communities can gain, was this vetted or against the additional costs and loss of jobs to account for a true cost benefit analysis? I assume that means, loss of ag jobs or jobs that were maintained on whatever that land was doing before. Is there a kind of, do you look at, and I'm assuming this is what's being asked, do you look at what was happening economically on that land and then judge, what you should be asking for in terms of like some of the employment kind of requirements and jobs created out of the project?
I mean, we've looked at kind of what acre of land support in the local economy, if it's supporting a dairy farm versus a solar project. And again, it's very soil productivity dependent. On our most productive agricultural lands, you know, uh, we've we think that uh, that acre supporting a cow is going to generate more economic activity in the local community than that acre supporting our solar panel. But when you start looking at some of our less productive lands that are still in agriculture, and that when it takes, so in other words, it's going to take more acres to feed that cow. And when it takes more acres to feed that cow, then actually the revenue from the solar project is outweighs the what could potentially be generated from an agricultural standpoint. So that's why I key in so much on the soil productivity side of it. Because if it's I strongly believe in protecting our best agricultural soils. But some of our marginal ones, I could make an argument that returning them to nature could have some benefits over keeping them in agriculture. And if we could generate revenue for the community by combining returning them to nature with a solar project, then that could actually be an economic win. So it's very dependent on soil type. But beyond that, I would just say, in that same analysis, and again, I'm not trying to be pro one way or the other. It's just these are just the numbers. That that I would say, um, at best, a dairy farmer may be netting um, $100 an acre or something off of that land, and there where they could get $1,000+ an acre annually for a lease payment. So again, I'm not saying that's one's better than the other, but just the sheer economics of it. If you're a landowner, I can't blame them for looking at what's going to generate that revenue. So, and yeah, I mean, we again, this is such a balance. I'm just looking at a few of the comments. Another comment came in about our support sectors for agriculture, and I would agree that there's a point in our rural communities where there's not enough land left in farming or enough farms left that week that can support a local equipment dealership or something like that. Um, and that's happened in New York already. There's already areas in New York where a farmer has to drive 2 hours to get to a tractor equipment dealership or get veterinary service, and that's very unfortunate. But as my first slide pointed out, solar is a tiny fraction of that relative to the land we're losing to all sorts of development. So is land lost to development an issue? Absolutely. When that land is more productive farmland, is, in my opinion, is that more of an issue? Absolutely. But if we look at the land lost over, over decades, energy is a tiny fraction of what we're losing to many other forms of development. So that's not to say one's better than the other. It's just to say that we have to be balanced about this and think about all the factors in our community that we're losing agricultural land to.
Thanks, Joe. A question I think is a good one for anyone. Are you aware of any collective community benefit agreement standard that's emerging within the renewables industry itself, either in New York or nationally?
Yeah. I don't know how close we are to a standard, but I would point out that in some states, CBAs are now mandatory under certain circumstances. So Michigan passed a very significant state level siting reform in 2023. And as part of that siting reform, if the Michigan Public Service Commission gets jurisdiction over a project, then the developer is required to enter into a community-based community benefits agreement. And it's sort of a two-step process where first they need to try to negotiate a community benefits agreement with the local government. And then if that fails, they need to negotiate an agreement with a community-based group. And the law specifies a minimum payment of $2,000 per megawatt. So, that's at least one data point for a statutory floor for community benefits.
Yeah, this is a really tricky, we're at a place right now where it's very difficult to see a standardized process even emerging, to be quite honest. Legislatively, we're working on creating a standard at the state level to be able to say, if state funds were used to support technical assistance at either the local level or to community-based organizations, what type of organization can receive those funds? And how could those funds be used? So I think, in terms of standardization, we're looking at that process in terms of money flow, but in terms of actual contracts and even the process used to achieve those contracts and what the asks are, I think we're more looking for, and developers want more flexibility, quite honestly.
Thanks. And CJ here in Tompkins County pointed out that the IDA revamped the large-scale solar policy earlier this year, and it suggests basically that the county's going to take those over, but that some towns still want to administer their own pilot agreements specifically. So maybe for Joe or for others also, how much of an appetite is there for a developer to negotiate more than one pilot?
And I honestly don't know if that's even possible. I could be wrong, but I'm not even sure if that's legally possible. I would say so. Any municipality can offer a municipal pilot in New York State, but they're limited to 15 years, and they have some other terms associated with them that, in our experience, generally renewable energy project developers have preferred the IDA pilots over the municipal pilots because the terms can be negotiated differently. The length of the pilots can be longer than 15 years, where the municipal ones are capped at 15. So I I I have no knowledge of a developer going with a municipal pilot because they don't tend to not like the terms. I'm not saying there's not one in New York because I can't say that conclusively. I don't know, but I have no knowledge of one. They definitely have told us in meetings that they prefer the ones the IDAs can offer. The other thing I would say is, by definition, the pilots IDAs offer that money is divvied up between the affected taxing jurisdictions based on tax rate. So the town is getting, it could be 25%, a third, whatever. It's based on the tax rates of the three municipalities. Schools in New York tend to be higher, so they tend to get more than the county or town because of their tax rates. But there is a process where if all three municipality, or if it's three, it could be four if there was a village involved or a city or something else. But we're usually talking rural areas, so usually it's the town, county, and school. They can agree to a deviation from the county's standard policy on pilots. And so they could get together as taxing jurisdictions and agree that the township gets more than what they would be allocated under the standard agreement based on tax rates. And we've seen that happen. So I think towns could work with their county IDAs on stuff like that. But I'm not aware that there could be two separate pilots, because essentially you're creating a double tax at that point. The pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes, which is covering all those three jurisdictions to begin with.
I think we've heard about it. I don't know if I've seen it, where the town opts out of participating in the county one. So I think they would have to opt out of it and then create their own slice of one. I don't know if Matthew, you have any insight into the sort of legal issues around that.
Yeah, I haven't been involved on the taxation side.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Another question: through experiences on the CBA issue, is there commonly a lower megawatt threshold before solar developers are willing to consider negotiating a CBA in rural communities?
Yeah, I can say that the smallest solar project where I've seen a CBA was a 20 megawatt project. There could be other examples, but generally the smaller projects are viewed as having smaller impacts, and it's just not as much worth the developer's time to negotiate a CBA for the smaller ones, and it's generally about 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. So at a 20 megawatt project, you're looking at 100 to 200 acres before you start to see CBAs.
Okay, thanks.
If we have time, there's another consideration there.
Yeah, please.
So we kind of looked at that as well. And that's another thing of like having our county-based community economic development fund versus each town having their own, is with some of the smaller projects, they may bring in such a small amount of money that it almost, even if the developer agreed to it, it's such a small amount of money for the town or something, it may not really be even worth pulling a group together to administer it. That's another benefit we feel of having our countywide community economic development fund, is that it was initiated through this one wind project, but future projects would go into that same fund if they're negotiated through our development corporation. So now we're building the capacity of that one fund in one central location versus having a whole bunch of tiny funds that were disconnected and not able to be leveraged with each other. So we feel that that it makes us more interested in even trying to negotiate them through our development corporation with the smaller projects, because it's going into a larger pool of money that can be have more benefits, if that makes sense.
And I see some concerns in the comments or in the chat, and we always hear about concerns about, the loss of farmland. So I know, Joe, you talked a little bit about how the funds coming in can be earmarked to kind of support the ag community. I don't know if anyone has some examples or even some thoughts on how when one farmer's getting paid for the project, but then the impacts are felt maybe in the community, how some of those benefits can then help be spread to sort of the broader ag community that might be impacted by loss of that farm store or some of the infrastructure they relied on, or like you said, leasing land that they now can't farm, have to go further away to get active or decent farmland.
I guess I don't have any, I shared a few ideas that we've talked about in terms of providing farms with funds to improve land or buy equipment or make other improvements like that.
And I guess yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There is definitely a difference between a small project. So a smaller project that may go on one landowner's land, and that if that farmer owns that, then the farm's directly receiving that revenue, and that tends to benefit the individual farm versus a farm that's leasing land and they lose that land. So that benefits the landowner. But actually can be a challenge to the farm because now they have to either downsize their farm or look further away to lease land. I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but I think it's serious that what is that landowner? The question is, what do they do with their lease payments? If they, and again, this is a bit tongue in cheek, but if they use that lease payment revenue to go buy a winter home in Florida, then that's not really helping the local economy, right? But if they use that lease payment money to go buy a compact tractor for their hobby farm and the land that they're still using, even though they're leasing to solar, then that could actually help keep the local equipment dealership in business because our local equipment dealerships sell as many compact tractors to hobby farmers as they do to our production farms. So, that's a bit of a, I think it might be a kind of a simplistic example, but I do believe there's some truth to it, as it comes down to how that money gets reinvested in the community or not.
Right. Excellent. All right, thank you. We're at 7 o'clock, and I want to honor that and let people go if you need to. Appreciate everyone's time.